Good morning. Our scripture reading this morning is Psalm 46. This can be found on page 517 in the Old Testament portion of your Pew Bible. Reading from Psalm 46. Hear what the Spirit says to the church. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear, though the earth should change, though the mountains shake in the heart of the sea, though its waters roar and foam, though the mountains tremble with its tumult. There is a river whose streams make glad the city of God, the holy habitation of the Most High. God is in the midst of the city. It shall not be moved. God will help it when the morning dawns. The nations are in an uproar. The kingdoms totter. He utters his voice. The earth melts. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our refuge. Come, behold the works of the Lord. See what desolations he has brought on the earth. He makes wars cease to the end of the earth. He breaks the bow and shatters the spear. He burns the shields with fire. Be still and know that I am God. I am exalted among the nations. I am exalted in the earth. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our refuge. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Elise has this set of plastic balls that she loves to play with because in the middle of them, they kind of nest together. There's this one small yellow ball that rattles, and she loves it. There's nothing that brings her more sheer crazy joy than to pull these balls apart and find the rattle in the middle of it all. But for some reason, sometimes the balls are stickier than other times, and she'll try to pull them apart. And balls that she could have pulled apart before, she will just not budge. And without fail, she has the exact same response and reaction every single time. She holds it out and says, "Please." When do we lose that instinct? There's an old story of a father who's watching his son try and pull a rock out of his sandbox. And he tries again and again, but this kid just can't get enough leverage to move the rock. I don't know how the rock got in there, but somehow he can't get it out. And finally, frustrated and exhausted, the kid collapses and sobs in tears on the side of his box. And the father walks out and says, "Son, you have to use all your strength if you want to move that rock." "But I did, Dad, I did," says the boy between sobs. "No, you didn't," replies the father. "You didn't ask me for help yet." At some point, we grow from that baby stage of just pure, boundless innocence, and we learn or we unlearn the reliance and the dependence on something else. Was it the first time that we found ourselves crossing some kind of imaginary boundary? And we taught ourselves that, somehow convinced ourselves that if we can cross one boundary line, I guess there's no boundaries that really ever will limit us? Was it the first time we impressed ourselves and said that if I can do this, what can't I do? Or was it the first time we saw somebody else doing something and said, if they have that, if they can do that, why can't I? At some point, there's a line in the sand of the human condition that all of us seem to walk across that says that we move from our first instinct being to ask for help to an stubborn insistence that in the language of living faith, one of the declarations of faith of the Presbyterian Church in Canada says that an insistence that we can be God in our own lives. The psalmist, I think, is trying to understand where that line happens, because what the psalmist seems to encounter is that this line is not new in human history. That 1,000 years before Christ shows up on the planet, the people are struggling with the exact same realities as 2,000 years after he shows up. That in a 3,000-year time span between when Psalm 46 was written and when it was read this morning, we have not gotten any better at this stubborn insistence that we should be God in our own lives. The psalmist thinks that there's an answer to this problem. And the psalmist writes that the answer to the question of how we find ourselves in this situation is that we have failed to see ourselves as a people of presence. 3 times in the psalm, the psalmist tells us that God is a God of presence, and we are a people built for presence. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in times of trouble. God is in the midst of the city. The Lord of hosts is with us. We are a people of presence made by a God of presence to incarnate the presence of God in the world around us. That's our aim. That's the entire thrust of what the psalmist wants us to see. That we live as a people of presence because we have a God of presence. And so the question that the psalmist really wants to approach, the question that he wants us to grapple and wrestle with, is how do we find ourselves in a situation where we can just accept the presence of God? How do we get to a state of being where the presence of God matters to us more than our own power to be whatever we think we want to be? I think that the psalmist helps us to chart a course to go from presence to stillness, from presence to praise. And the psalmist takes us through what I think is a roadmap for the Christian life. He lays out the entirety in 9 verses of what a Christian is called to be and what a Christian can become when we commit ourselves to relying on this strange, beautiful phrase at the end of the passage, to be still and know that I am God. This is one of those phrases that, like last week, doesn't make sense all the time when we read about it in our English translations. Because like I was talking about with the kids, we hear be still and we think automatically in English about a verbal, structured language. Be something. Be tells us to go and do. And so all of a sudden we start thinking about, okay, now how am I going to be still here in this moment? How am I going to build stillness in my life? Because I've got to take and I've got to figure this out for myself, because that's what the Bible says I need to do. I need to figure out my own sense of stillness. The Hebrew offers a much clearer picture. The Hebrew simply says, stop doing and know that I am God. The identity of God is central to the entire scope of what the psalmist is trying to help us capture. The identity of who God is at the very center of God's presence. That God is the God who at once can provide manna from heaven and at the same time can provide a pillar of smoke and fire for the people of God to follow. It's the God who can wipe everything clean with a flood, but who can also enact a covenant that can never be broken. God is the God of immeasurable presence because he's the God of unsurmountable power. God's power is the first piece of understanding what it means to be still and know that I am God. To get to this point of power and to get to this point of experiencing God's power in our own lives is not always something that's easy to approach. Because we like to think about God's power in the miraculous sense, don't we? We like to think about God's power as the big showy things in life. We like to think about God's power as miraculous healings and supernatural deliverances. We like to think about God's power as ways that we can hold in our hand and we can quantify and qualify. And we like to think about God's power as something special, something we can control and wield like a sword. But the power that God seems to operate with in the Bible is a power of a very different sort. That's why more than 1,000 years after this psalm was written, the Apostle Paul looked back on it and reflected and named the power of God as this Yeshua Bar Yaakov, Jesus of Nazareth, the Christ of God. He looked at this and declared to the Corinthians, to the Romans, to the Gentiles in every city he visited, that this crucified Jewish rabbi is the full power of God on display for the world. That the power of God is so magnificent, so insurmountable, and so unconquerable that there is nothing that this world can throw at God, including death, that God cannot overcome. This is the power of God on display in the world, that there is nothing you can put in God's way that God can't step over. There is no rock that you can put in God's sandbox that God can't simply pick up and take out. God is our very present help in time of trouble. He is our refuge and our strength. He is the power in our hands, but it's a power that operates in a world in a totally different way than the world has ever anticipated. Because it operates by simply saying, you know what? God is working in the background in ways that we can't see, we can't know, but we get to trust. Because the resurrection of Jesus Christ makes Christianity the most falsifiable religion in the world. Everything hinges on that. If Christ rose, let me put it this way. If somebody predicts their own death and then their own resurrection and then pulls it off, don't you think maybe we should do what that guy says? All of Christianity, all of the power inherent in Christianity hinges on the question of whether or not the tomb was empty on Sunday morning. In fact, the author Luke of the book of Acts wants to make this point so clearly that he reminds the people that Gamaliel, one of the great Pharisees, one of the great non-Christians in his time, was so convinced of the persistent, unsurpassed power of God that he urged people to treat the Christians with carefulness. He said in Acts 5 that be careful how you treat these people. Because if it's not from God, if what they're doing is not from God, it will fade away like everything does. But if it is from God, then you may very well find yourselves fighting against God. That is the power of God. Not that we do anything, not that we have anything, but that God has everything through us. Central to this idea is what we call in church the theological reality that God doesn't need us. So much of our time and energy seems to go into thinking that God needs us to do what God can't do on his own. God needs us for all the gifts that I bring. God needs me for my eloquence and my capability and my gifting. God doesn't need me. Am I so arrogant to think that if I wasn't here, that God couldn't do what I'm doing already? Are you so confident in your uniqueness, in your unique special standing before God, that you think that God could not replace you like that? God needs none of us because God's power is so much greater than we can possibly imagine. And there's a humility in that causes us to sit back and say, the God who is powerful, the God who is our help and our refuge in times of trouble, can do more with less than I can do on my best day. first step in the Christian journey is a recognition of the sheer power of God and a recognition in our own lives that that power calls us to a place of humility, to a place of trust. Because trust is in short supply in the world. Every year, the Edelman Group, and with Pew Research since 1980, has completed a worldwide study of what they call societal trust. The willingness of people to say yes or no to the question, do you think that most people are trustworthy or not? Every year since they began doing this study in 1980, the number of people who say no to that question has gone up, and the number of people who say yes to it, by consequence, has gone down. In 2019, societal trust hit an all-time low, with only 41% of Canadian respondents saying, yes, most people are trustworthy. 41% of Canadians believe that most people are trustworthy. Never mind that crime is at the lowest level it's ever been at. Never mind that violence is at historic lows. Never mind that theft and robbery and every category of crime is also at some of the lowest levels in human history. Only 41%, so that means that 59% of Canadians believe that most people around them are not worthy of trust. But the church is built on trust. In fact, the church is the only organization that's built on trust. Every other social group, every other organization, every other society or team or group of people either has a membership fee or a set of principles that guide their identity, that create an us and a them. The church, by contrast, says, you know what? You belonged well before you believed. That's why our baptismal font is so small. It's a sign and a seal of your belonging the moment that you were born. The church welcomes everybody into this center, into this sphere, into this reality of life with God. It doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter what you look like. It doesn't matter what you have or what you can do. Belonging precedes believing. And that forces the church to operate on a level of trust. To me, it's no small coincidence that these two realities coexist, that as church attendance decreases, societal trust drops off the map. Because the church is the beacon of trust in the world. We trust each other to be able to do what I can't do on my own, but we also trust each other that I don't need to do everything because I have all of you. The church's most basic mission statement or vision statement is that I need you and you need me. The reality of the church is in life together is that we are a people of radical dependence on each other. That we rely on the people sitting around us to do what we can't do, and we give ourselves and we give what we can do over to the people around us, because that's trust. Trusting as a church forces us to trust in the presence and the power of God. To say that even if things aren't as good as I could do them, if I did everything, things wouldn't be as good as they can be. So we rely on each other. We depend on each other. We trust each other. And through that process of building trust and practicing trust, the church develops a steady patience. Patience was the most written about subject in the first 3 centuries of Christianity. In the first 3 centuries of Christian thought and Christian theology, what the church called the cardinal discipline was not purity, was not humility, was not anything other than patience. From Cyprian of Carthage to Justin Martyr in Rome to Origen and Tertullian and Lucentius, all of the great, what we call the great desert fathers, urged the church not to evangelize, not to engage in mission, not to do anything, but to mark themselves as a people of patience. Patience was the great mark of the church in the first 3 centuries. Through its greatest period of expansion, through the time when the church was at its healthiest and at its zenith, the church was marked by patience. Every decision that the church made went through the rubric of, is this forcing us as a people to rely on the power and the presence of God? To become a member of that church took 3 years because patience was their guiding principle. To be involved in anything, to practice your business, according to Justin Martyr, required the patience that only a Christian could really enact. Justin Martyr said that when a Christian engages in business, they have an obligation to practice patience as their first business practice. When people cheat you, don't presume it's your job to judge them or to enact judgment or to make that cheating right. Because that's God's job. And God will do it on God's time. Your job is to keep loving that person and keep being generous and charitable. Remember that Jesus said, when someone strikes you on the right cheek, you turn the left to them as well, because you're a people of patience. So too, people like Origen or Cyprian of Carthage wrote that patience is actually the chief value of the Christian in witnessing to the world. That we love people not so that we can get them across some kind of imaginary line, but that we love them consistently and faithfully because God is working in their lives. The Christians' patient evangelism in the first 3 centuries of Christianity, the time when the church grew the fastest, the church's patient evangelistic strategy was to love people until God told them to stop. And the funny thing was that God never told them to stop. They were a people of unremarkable, unrelenting, trusting, powerful patience. And Origen writes that people responded. People found themselves so intrigued, Origen says, by the strange patience of the church, that they found themselves drawn into the worship of God's people. That they found themselves sitting in what was then called the narthex. The place. So, all right, that's sidebar. So we used to talk about the narthex the way we talked about a foyer in church. The narthex literally was the outside of an onion, and it was the place in church where the people who weren't baptized had to stay. It was the place in church life where the non-Christians got to experience the worship of God. It was an outer place, and it was a shell that separated it from them. Presbyterians don't have narthexes anymore. I hear people talk about it, and people who have heard me talk about it know it's my thing. Anyway, that's fine. Time in. The early church drew people in with their steady, persistent, powerful patience into the narthex of their church, into the outer life of their church, so that they began to crave this life together that Christians experience, this generosity and this powerful presence. There is a power at work in the church. And the church, for all its functionalism, for all the ways we tend to operate on a needs-based basis, forgets that we are a people first and foremost of powerful presence. That is the defining characteristic of the church. It's not a social organization. It is not a community club. It is not something that exists for the sake of anything other than the passion and the vision God has given it to. Because we are the people, we are the very expression of the presence of God incarnated in the world today. We are where the hands and feet of Christ are present for our community and our neighborhood. We are where the voice and the love of Christ are experienced in tangible, patient ways. We are where God is found. So the psalmist, knowing all of this, seeing the powerful presence of God in his own life, wrote and urged the church in every age to do what only the church can do. Be still and know that I am God. Be still and see God as the still point in the turning universe. Be still and know that God is God even when things are hairy, even when things are hectic, even when things go off the rails, even when things seem hard. Be still and know that I am God. God has not left the church. God will not leave the church. God has more in store for the church he loves, if we'll be still and know. Thanks be to God.